Well, it's my pleasure to introduce two speakers today. We have on one hand Bronwyn Price. She is physically here in our room, while Nika Huber, the other presenter, is joining us online. Bronwyn has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Melbourne, Australia, and a PhD from the ETH in Zurich in ecological modeling. She has then worked at WSL for the past 8 years, you told me, largely in the remote sensing group. And her research focused on land use and land cover dynamics, modeling of above ground woody biomass, and the topic of today's presentation, of course, which is modeling Swiss habitat types. Nika Huber, on the other hand, studied environmental sciences at the ETH Zurich. She did a PhD in the forest ecology group there, with a focus on process-based modeling. And here at WSL, she has been working with species distribution models, habitat models, not too surprisingly, given today's talk, GIS and remote sensing. And for the last 2 years, she has been working as a postdoc for the Habitat Map of Switzerland project. This Habitat Map of Switzerland project has been run by a very small team. We have the majority of the core team present here today over the past 2 years, and the project aims to provide the first wall-to-wall map, base map of habitat types for the entire country. And it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here today and see these results, because about 2 years ago, I also joined one of the very first meetings. I was there to give an short input talk. I was very keen to see what happens with the project. So, Bronwyn, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rafi. Thanks, and thanks for stepping in to chair the meeting at the last minute. Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong thing. So. Okay. So, the plan today is to introduce the habitat map of Switzerland that we've been working on for the past 2 years. And, we started this project thinking about why we need a habitat map. And as we all know, habitats are increasingly used to assess the status of biodiversity, and the classification of environments into defined habitats provides us with a reference system for field data and facilitates monitoring of change. And if we want to manage for biodiversity goals, we need to know where habitats are. So a relatively recent OECD environmental performance review for Switzerland highlighted the need for a national ecosystem or habitat map to prioritise biodiversity. So this kind of finding led the Swiss Federal Office for Environment to contract us to undertake the habitat mapping of Switzerland project. So the habitat classification of Delarze, also known as the TIPO-CH classification, is the most widely used habitat classification for Switzerland. And although there's some regional modelling of this classification system, there's no spatially explicit distribution map of habitats across Switzerland. And there's a strong demand for this data from researchers and government bodies, and in particular to support ecological infrastructure mapping and modelling. So our objectives were to develop a wall-to-wall spatially explicit map of the Swiss habitats according to the TIPO-CH classification to the second level, and I'll explain the levels in a moment. And as I said before, we were funded by the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, and the idea is that the output should be suitable for research, practitioners, lay people, and it should be a base data set that allows for further analysis and monitoring change, specifically ecological infrastructure. The idea is that at the end, the data would be available as a vector data set and will be openly available, for instance, on Map GeoAdmin, and that we should have a methodology that allows for updates with updates of the base data set and changes over time, and that the whole mapping should be based on remote sensing data. So these are I guess, our our aim habitats that we wanted to map across the two levels of the tipotihar classification. So we have broad level classes, water, riparian, glaciers, etc. And then they're divided into second level and in some cases into a third level. And for grassland habitats and forest, we attempted also to classify the habitats down to the third level. So the tipotihar classification system is a hierarchical system. So has at least 3 levels, and the top level is a more geographic approach, and the third level is a plant sociological approach. So the first level is 9 habitat classes, and they're defined by plant's dominant life form and environmental factors. So this is a top-down approach, and we have these 9 habitat classes. The second level, there's 41 habitat groups, and they're classified according to a key. And that's just an example there of, for instance, how the class 6.2 beech forest will be classified at the second level. And I won't go into details, just an example to explain what the second level is. The third level is other habitat types, and they're based on species composition. So this is a bottom-up approach at the third level. And each habitat type is defined by character species and typical species. And that results in then a specific habitat type, for example, an orchid beech forest. So our methodology, coming from the remote sensing perspective, was to start with the base of aerial imagery. And I'll go through this in a bit more detail in a moment, but then we wanted to segment that imagery into image segments based on similarities with NDVI, spectral reflectance. And then we wanted to classify that segmented image using auxiliary data, specifically the land cover from the topographical landscape model and habitat models, where my mouse is not working very well. And then, that's kind of the key part, segmenting the image and classifying the image into habitat types. And then we overlay this with fine detailed information on roads and buildings to come to a final habitat map. So we have we use the aerial imagery, which is at 1 metre resolution for the whole of Switzerland, and we divided it into the 247 1 to 25,000 resolution map sheets. And that imagery is in red, green, blue and near infrared spectral bands. Then we segmented those images into segments of similar spectral properties. So that's a false colour composite aerial image, and then we see that the segmentation occurs to divide them up into different segments. So we use the eCognition software for this process, and the object-oriented segmentation uses both the spectral and the spatial information and clusters sets of pixels together into objects on the basis of their spectral properties. Also takes into account context for the neighbourhood, texture, etc. And we use a 2-step process, as I already said, first the segmentation and then the classification of those segments. I pretty much said all of this already. So from the 1 metre resolution imagery, we create the image segments, and then we have a complex rule-based approach to assign the habitats to segments. And this classification is supported by spatial data and particularly models that we developed for different habitat types. So, exactly. So we use the topographical landscape model, our habitat models, and the vegetation height model to help us classify the image segments. So that's just an example of the rule set we use within eCognition. We end up with a classified image that would look something like that. And then we overlay that with roads and building footprints and details on land use that we have available from the topographical landscape map. And then we end up with a final habitat map. So what the rest of the talk is going to focus on a bit is the habitat models part of our work. So we had quite good data already for some of the habitat groups, such as water bodies, glaciers and rocky debris, and buildings and structures. And the focus in the project over the last 2 years is on these habitats highlighted in the kind of orange-yellow colour, specifically what Nika will talk about on grasslands and riparian areas and wetlands, also on some parts of the class 5, specifically shrub forest and dwarf shrubs, and then also on forest habitats. We did not have the capacity to look too much into the pioneer vegetation, so that wasn't a strong focus. And we also modelled the crops and plantations. So we'll start with talking about the grassland, wetland and arable land modelling. So the herbaceous vegetation can belong to different habitat classes at level 1 of the classification. So basically wetlands, grasslands and arable land. We differentiate between arable land and wetlands and grassland as basically permanent grassland and arable land. Arable land all goes into the class 8.2, and the permanent grassland is further classified through a more in-depth modelling process. So the first step we tried was to distinguish permanent grassland from arable land. This work was done by Robert Patzur. He conducted a random forest modelling approach. So we had 2 different models, one for the lowland areas and one for the alpine areas. And he used a time series of Sentinel-2 imagery over the growing season, so from April to November, and all data between 2017 and 2019. And that helped us to distinguish the permanent grassland from the crop area. And he performed some accuracy assessment using ALEMA data and the Area Statistica land use data. And now I'll hand over to Nika to talk about the modelling of the grassland and wetland, which was one of the largest parts of our project over the last 2 years.
Thank you, Bronwyn. As Bronwyn already mentioned, we model most of the grassland and wetland habitat types at the 3rd level. So the most detailed one, because also within the 2nd level, so the groups, the habitat types are sometimes quite diverse from each other. And only for the reseeded and heavy fertilized grasslands, so the 4.0, the snowbed communities and the fallow grassland, we did the modeling on the 2nd level. Then regarding the data, next slide, please. We collected data from various sources, mainly from field surveys. So for example, from the BDM, but also from surveys within biotopes of national importance. Altogether, we collected around 50,000 vegetation samples with a typo CH classification. And from this data, we then derived 2 data sets, a training data set and a testing data set. And within each of these data sets, we ensured that the distance between the samples was at least 300 meters to avoid spatial autocorrelation. And the training data set still, of course, mainly was composed of grassland and wetland habitat samples, but it also included samples of other habitat types, such as, for example, forests, while the testing data set only focused on the target habitat types, so on grassland and wetland habitat types. So the next slide, please. We collected quite a diverse set of predictors, and most of them were describing vegetation. For this, we used remote sensing predictors based on Sentinel 1 and 2 indices. Then to consider soil properties, we used the ecological indicator values derived by Patrice de Gond. Then for topography, we could use the terrain attributes calculated by Andri Waldensweiler. And then in addition, we used a set of climatic predictors as well. Next. Yeah, then we first, we modeled each habitat type individually. And here you just have the overview of this routine. First, we selected, of course, the presences for each habitat type and a set of absences from the training data set. Then we pre-selected the predictors for each habitat type because we had quite a large set of predictors. So to include the most relevant predictors for each habitat type and a set of predictors that was not highly correlated with each other. Then for the distribution modeling, we applied an ensemble modeling approach with 4 model types, so GLMs, GAMs, random forest, and boosted regression trees. And we performed a 10-fold cross-validation. So this gave us then 40 prediction maps for each habitat type. And we aggregated these maps into a map of the median of the predicted probability of occurrence, a map of the standard deviation, and a binary presence-absence map. And next, please. Yeah, here we have an example for the Mesobromion. This is a dry meadow. On the left, we have the predicted probability of occurrence, and on the right, the corresponding standard deviation. And the next, we can see a comparison to the current distribution as it is shown in the book by Delarze and colleagues. This current distribution is derived from plant observations of character and indicator species. And we see spatially a very high agreement between the two maps. And of course, the modeled map has a much higher spatial resolution with this 10 meter. Yeah, it's a 10 meter spatial resolution. Yeah, this figure shows the true scale statistics for each habitat type. So from the 10-fold cross-validation, and habitat types with the highest performance were like the raised bogs, the reseeded grasslands, and one of the, yeah, they are all together, the 3 there, and one of the dry grasslands. And lowest performance had the fallow grassland, and also the rich patches and meadows were more towards the bottom end of the performance. So this was all about like modeling of grassland types at the 3rd level, so individually. Now the question arose, I mean, we mainly did this to integrate the information about the habitat types into the overall habitat map of Switzerland. And yeah, now we had the question, how should we integrate all these outputs from all these models? And to not end up with a very high, large rule set in eCognition, we decided that we will generate a combination map, and this map should show the most likely grassland or wetland habitat type for each 10 to 10 meter grid cell. And we tested different approaches, how we could combine the modeled habitat types into one combination map. And the most promising one was like a, next slide, please. The maximum weighted probability approach. So the main idea of this approach is that the habitat type with the highest median of predicted probability of occurrence is assigned to the respective grid cell, but we had 2 further steps included here. So we do not only consider the median maps, but also the presence-absence maps. So if the presence-absence maps indicates an absence, the respective habitat type could not be selected to occur in the most likely, in the respective grid cell of the combination map. And then in addition, we included an expert-based weighting. So if necessary, the median of an individual habitat type could be weighted. This allows to increase the area of underrepresented habitat types and decrease the area in the combination map of overrepresented habitat types. And yeah, these weights were derived based on discussing example maps with field experts. And yeah, we had this, when we then select the maximum of the weighted median. This gives us then the most likely habitat type. And we can also select or create a map with the second most likely habitat type by just selecting the second most highest value. So it's just the same procedure. Then we have these two maps. Yeah, this is how the map looks like. Here for readability, we only see the second level, but of course the map itself contains the information about the third level assignment. And yeah, when we look at it like from this broad scale across Switzerland, it looks quite plausible with, for example, the wet habitat types mainly occurring in the northern pre-Alps and the dry grasslands mainly being present in the Jura Mountains and the dry inner alpine valleys. Then in the next slide here, we see some overview statistics for individual habitat types as they are represented in the combination map. We have two examples, again, the Mesopromion on the left, the dry meadow, and then the Arenatherion on the right side. This is a rich meadow. And yeah, we can see here the share of grid cells that were assigned to the respective habitat type across elevation, slope, aspect, and bioregion. These figures or overview summaries here refer to the combination map, but we plan to provide this also for all the habitat types as they were then assigned in the final product, so in the overall habitat map of Switzerland. Yeah, of course, we evaluated the performance of the combination maps in different ways with confusion matrices and others. And here we see the misclassifications. So if a habitat type was misclassified, to which group then the misclassification was assigned. And as we can see, for example, for the alpine and subalpine grasslands, most of the misclassifications occurred within the same group at the second level. So we see there a lot of large gray bars. So then not the correct alpine or subalpine grassland type was assigned, but another one from the same group. And there are a few habitat types, grassland types, that showed misclassifications across groups. One example is the Arenatherion. Again, this is the 4.5.1. This showed quite a high share of misclassification with dry grasslands. And yeah, in addition, we also did a comparison of the predicted proportions of all the habitat types with estimated proportions from field surveys, once in biotopes of national importance. This is based on the VBS data, and on the other hand, in agricultural area of Switzerland, this is from estimations of the ALIMA data sets. Yeah, these results are still preliminary. We have high to medium agreement. So for example, predicted shares of dry grasslands showed very high agreement with the two estimation or projections from these two data sets, while the raised box, they tend to be underestimated in the combination map, and the rich pastures and meadows on the other, yeah, they also tend to be underestimated. And for the alpine and subalpine grasslands, it depends a bit on the habitat type, but we have there some that are clearly overestimated. Yeah, then just to finish, I'd like to mention some general issues of the combination map. Of course, there are some troubles occurring where for areas where none of the modeled habitat type fits well. So there the assignment becomes a bit random. And for such cases, we ensured that not a really rare habitat type was assigned. So we applied their stricter threshold in the presence absence, in the binary presence absence map. Then, due to large-scale patterns of soil moisture, there's a tendency to overestimate wet habitats in wet areas and a difficulty to identify wet areas in dry areas. And we introduced some regional corrections to address this, but it's very clear that there is room for improvement and some regional modeling efforts are required to really address this issue. Then we have a problem with green spaces in urban areas. This is mainly a problem due to the spatial resolution of the Sentinel. So green spaces in urban areas are highly fragmented. They are most often quite patchy, small scale, and surrounded by sealed areas. And yeah, there the 10-meter resolution of the Sentinel is just not high enough to allow for a distinction or classification of green spaces in urban areas. And if we use the combination map as a standalone product, there are some problems with transitions to habitat types that have not been modeled, especially other green and grassy vegetation. This is not such an issue if we then integrate the combination map into the final habitat map, because there these other habitat types are considered mostly. Yeah, and with this, I give back to Bronwyn.
Thank you, Nika. Yeah, so one of the grassland types that we treated separately as a kind of special case was snowbed communities. Nika modelled the potential snowbed communities in a similar approach as she did with the other grasslands, but because snowbed communities are rather a special and rather small, fine-scale habitat, we didn't want to include the model directly in the same way as the other grasslands. So we used that approach to identify potentially suitable areas, and then we restricted the modelled area by trying to identify areas that had snow cover in June and no more snow cover in July. And we used that. We did that using the PlanetScope satellite. What do I want to say? Constellation to identify the snow cover. So this is an example of Nika's model with the potential. The black and white is the potential snowbed communities, and these are mapped snowbed communities from cantonal mapping, and or not even cantonal, just specific mapping project. And you can see we'd overestimate snowbed communities a lot if we just use the model directly. The Planet satellite constellation is a 3 to 5 meter resolution imagery, and it has potentially daily revisits, so that could give us a lot of potential to find the places that have snow cover in June and not in July. And they do offer monthly cloud-free composites, but it's quite pricey. So we first did a test pilot to see how well we could map these by downloading the JPEG previews, georeferencing them, and then classifying those into snow-covered areas. And then we could determine the areas that had snow cover in June and none in July. So this is an example from the same area, the Marcoon in the Graubünden. This is the snow cover in June 2020. And it's quite unclear because it's the JPEG preview and not the original data. And then this is the snow cover in July 2020. So we see all the areas which had snow cover in June and not in July. So that would be these red areas. And then we can reduce those areas with Nika's model. And then this is just an example of the overlap between the mapped snowbed communities and what we found with the 1 year of Planet data. So this was a test. We will include this in the habitat map, but there's a lot of scope for improvement. Specifically, if we had the data over a longer time period rather than just one season, we should be able to better identify the snowbed communities. Now we're going to move into the class 5, which is herbaceous fringes, tallforbs, bushes and dwarf shrubs. Our approach here was in some cases based just on the vegetation height model from the National Forest Inventory and the forest mask, but there was also a separate project whose results we were able to integrate using random forest models to differentiate, to recognise shrub forests. So for forest clearings, tallforbs in the forest clearings, which is class 5.2, we were able to use, so we have the forest mask, the NFI forest mask that shows us where forest is, but within the forest mask there are often areas with low vegetation height, and we had the vegetation height model from 2012 and the vegetation height model from 2020, and we basically used that to find areas within the forest mask that had vegetation in high vegetation in 2012, no longer had high vegetation in 2020, as these could be areas which known as the Schlagfluten in German, so areas which had damage to forest and potentially have this high fall cover in forest clearings. So that's just an example, of the areas we identified in the map with the false composite image, and in yellow is highlighted what we have in the map as class 5.2. Then the work from Marius Ricci and also Dominic Weber, who's here, on modelling shrub forest and dwarf shrubs was integrated into the project. So they modelled using random forest modelling 2 classes of shrub forest, green alder forest and mountain pine forest, which belong to 2 different Delarze classes. So they also used satellite imagery from Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. So Sentinel-1 giving, there's a radar satellite giving vegetation height. They also incorporated the vegetation height model, the digital terrain model, and training data from aerial image interpretation. And basically it was a classification with a random forest decision tree, which allowed to separate forest from shrubland using the vegetation height model, and validation with independent data from the National Forest Inventory. So they did an original test project in Canton Graubünden, and then this was further developed for the rest of Switzerland. This is so there was feedback from the cantons showing that the shrub forest stands are covered quite well, but certain areas are underestimated. So that was the original output for the model, and then there's area, for example, there where the shrub forest distribution was underestimated. So they used a smallest margin of uncertainty approach, where basically if the model is uncertain, then the distribution of the shrub forest can be extended out into these uncertain areas, but not into these areas where the model is quite certain. In addition, Nika also modelled dwarf shrub forests, again using the similar SDM approach as to what you described for the grasslands, but with different training data. So the data was based on aerial image interpretation, which Anita Nussbaumer did for us, on just 5 map sheet areas. So we had almost 800 presences and a bit over 4,500 absences. And we used the Sentinel indices plus texture variables from the grey level co-occurrence matrix. And yes, as I said, the approach was the same for the grassland and the wetland modelling. And that's just an example of the output for dwarf shrubs, which is class 5.4. For the forests part of our habitat map, we depended on existing species distribution models. There's a number of projects already going on within WSL, from Rafi, by Daniel, also Laza has a project for species distribution models. Some of those projects, particularly Daniel's and Laza's project, were running at the same time as ours. And given that we only had 2 years for the project, it didn't make sense for us to also invest a lot of time in work that people have already done. So we used we use the results from Rafi's project, the Mowgli project, which models the potential distribution of approximately 70 Swiss woody species. Rafi used also an ensemble modelling approach, bringing in topography, climate, soil data, and data from LiDAR. With the statistical modelling, and that ending up with maps of the potential distribution of these approximately 70 woody species. We then took those models and combined them using the dominant and character species for each of the Tipotzeha forest habitat groups. And so we regrouped them where we could into the level 3 habitat forest types using those character indicator species. And for some habitat types, we don't have a distribution model of the relevant character species. In those cases, then we often group to level 2 or even just level 1 forest where it wasn't possible. That's an example of what it looks like, our result looks like in the end. So just using the example of a chestnut forest. So we had from the Mowgli data distribution of the key character species and dominant species, which we then combined to find the areas where all of these, the likely distribution of these overlapped, to then distinguish a chestnut forest. And we did this for all of the Tipotzeha forest classes, and then we end up with a map like this. And the idea is that where later we will integrate, for instance, the result from Daniel's work and from Lars's work to improve on our forest distribution modelling. And that's just an example of our approach on the left and the cantonal mapping on the right. So it's overall the patterns are plausible. There's certainly differences when it comes to the detailed level, but in general, it's relatively plausible. And of course, we were able to model the most common habitat types much easier than we were able to model the rare habitat. That's just a general map of the distribution of our modelled habitat types in the different bioregions. With the blue forest types are the kind of wet forest types in floodplains, etc. The 6.2 is beach forests, 6.3 are other broadleaf forests, and then the 6.4 are the Hochmoore, I've just forgotten the English word, sorry. And 6.5 is the Hochmoore, 6.4 are the dry forest, and 6.6 is the mountain coniferous forest. So that's we come back to the overview. So that was where we largely talked about the habitat models, and then we brought those in to classify the imagery, the segments, and then we come to the final habitat map. We talked a lot about the validation that she did within model validations, for example, cross-validation. We found that the standard statistical evaluation, such as confusion matrices, was often difficult, sometimes limited data, and sometimes can be misleading, such as multi-class and imbalanced data. We often had that we could classify within the group well, but not necessarily the individual habitat types. So we had quite a strong focus on plausibility analyses with expert groups. We had workshops with a core group of experts, and we did that in two separate rounds and provided example map sheets and had a lot of discussion back and forth. Then certain individual experts did visual inspection of known habitat areas areas that they knew well, and did a detailed analysis of particular map sheets, and that helped us. We fed that back into our process to improve our modelling, and in particular the rule sets within eCognition. And Nika described that as well, that we did some comparison of estimated proportions of habitats in different biotopes using, for example, the diversity modelling data or agricultural data from LAMA. So this is kind of what the habitat map will look like in the end, and there should be an online release of the data in early October, so in a few weeks, hopefully. And it will be, the first release will be on the virtual data centre, WSL's virtual data centre, so there'll be access for all sort of cantonal authorities, BAFU, WSL, etc. And then we plan to also release the data on MapGeoAdmin and EnviDat. That will take a little bit longer, but should be in the new year. And yeah, it will look something like that. On the virtual data centre, we have the opportunity for feedback, so users can click on individual polygons if they want and write comments or even overall comments. And we hope to then be able to bring in the feedback to help us with improvements. So this is kind of the status of how we see how well we think we've been able to model the different habitat classes and what we know needs improvement sooner and what will be improved in the longer term, assuming we're able to continue with improvements. So we don't plan to change the things like water bodies and buildings, because that's kind of the standard data from the topographical landscape model. We think the riparian area and grassland areas have been modelled quite well, but there will be certain regions where we need to have a little bit more emphasis with the riparian banks with vegetation on them, we also need some improvements there. In the class 5, we feel like the shrub forests are modelled quite well. The herbaceous areas, the Kreuzheimer, we know in fact, we decided in the end to leave those out because we weren't able to model them very well at all. So that's something we really need to concentrate on for improvements in the next step. And also with the dwarf shrub forests, in certain regions and certain types of dwarf shrub forests, we'd like to have a bit more focus on that. And as I said before, we intend to integrate the ongoing WSL projects into the forest habitat classes as we can. Pioneer vegetation disturbed places we have not covered very well, and we're aware of that. We'll look into areas where we can improve that. Obviously, they're very dynamic habitats, so that's something we need to work on further. And then within the class 3, for longer term improvements, we hope to improve on our modelling of alluviums and moraines. And aside from also some general improvement planning, urban areas, as Nitka mentioned, we have the urban area, green areas are not modelled very well for a specific habitat type due to the high resolution there and the intensive modification by humans. So we've had a master's thesis working on looking at how to better map habitat types within urban areas, and we hope to build from that to come up with an approach where we can better look at the habitat types within urban areas. It's also the classification typology is not necessarily designed for urban areas, so we may have to have some slightly different classifications within an urban area. And another thing we are hoping to test is whether we could use the planet imagery that I mentioned before that we use for snowbeds instead of the aerial ortho imagery, because then we could cover the whole of Switzerland in the same year and the same season, and we've got more opportunities to detect dynamic habitats because there's a much more high temporal resolution of the planet imagery than we have of the aerial imagery. So that brings me to the end of our description of the project, and obviously we're happy, Nitka as well, to take any questions. Thanks.